Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today takes us into the analytical framework presented in the TED Talk by Heni Ozi Cukier. It uses this four-dimensional historical lens, social, economic, political, and military, to sort of gauge the risks of major global conflict right now. And the central issue, really, that comes out of this analysis is critical. Does the alignment of current events across these four dimensions, echoing the periods right before World War I and World War II, does that constitute a credible and urgent warning that we are genuinely on the path toward a new global conflict? My position is that, yes, the patterns identified form an undeniable historical rhyme, suggesting we're nearing an inflection point where the critical prerequisites for large-scale war are dangerously aligned.
And I suppose I come at it from a slightly different angle. While the trends the speaker highlights are certainly serious and they demand attention, I would caution that relying quite so heavily on historical analogies, particularly ones as monumental as the lead-up to the World Wars, it risks overstating the current danger. I mean, this method can sometimes oversimplify the unique complexity and the fundamentally new deterrents we have in the modern world. My worry is the framework might risk confirming a predetermined conclusion, conflict, rather than giving us a truly balanced risk assessment.
Well, what makes this methodology compelling, I think, is that it moves beyond just superficial comparisons. It focuses instead on these deep-seated systemic trends. And what the speaker demonstrates is a kind of compounding structural danger. If you look first at the political and military dimensions, they show the most alarming alignment. Politically, we're seeing escalating polarization leading directly to political violence. I mean, the assault on the U.S. Capitol, the huge surge in attacks on politicians in Europe, these are powerful examples. And these situations, they eerily parallel the political violence that really tore through the Balkans before 1914, and the assassinations and militia struggles that destabilized the Weimar Republic. History seems pretty clear on this. Once trust in institutions fails and armed factions emerge to settle disputes, compromise ends and systemic collapse becomes probable. Militarily, the integration of what the video calls the axis of dictatorships, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, is noted as being much more united than the rather decentralized Axis powers of the 1930s. This tight, unified alliance dramatically shifts the incentive structure toward aggression, especially when they might perceive they're facing a divided Western alliance.
That's a strong opening point. But I find the historical framework may be weakest when it's applied to the economic and social dimensions. Let's start with economics. The parallel drawn between today's drive for self-sufficiency and the extreme economic nationalism of the interwar period, which, yes, fueled expansionist wars, it risks ignoring the vastly different structure of today's global economy. I mean, sure, prosperity alone didn't prevent World War I, but the sheer scale of current U.S.-China interdependence, just as one example, represents a deterrent cost structure far, far higher than anything seen in 1914. Initiating a major conflict today almost means mutually assured economic destruction. That's a factor that fundamentally alters the historical rhyme, doesn't it? And socially, yes, I recognize the deep anxiety driven by rapid technological change, AI, digital fragmentation. But this anxiety feels structurally different from the historical collapse of traditional authorities, the monarchies, the established churches that preceded World War I. Those historical collapses channeled mass discontent into these singular, often militaristic ideologies. Today's social instability, while dangerous, it often seems more diffuse, maybe more decentralized.
Okay, I recognize the material supports your argument about economic deterrence, but let's dig a bit deeper into the political fracture, because that really determines whether institutions can actually withstand the pressure. You mentioned Weimar, the Austro-Hungarian periphery. The source highlights that the violence today, those over 10,000 attacks on German politicians in 5 years, the attempt to overturn democratic election results in the U.S., that is the clearest signal that the political order is failing internally. Now, I'm not saying we are identical to Weimar, but the process, the political dehumanization, the willingness of armed groups to challenge legitimate political authority, that is strikingly similar. And that willingness is what precedes systemic war. when political actors stop believing in the democratic process and start turning to the militia or the mob, whether it's 1913 or 2023, the system is genuinely on the brink. The fundamental fragility isn't the external threat, perhaps, but the internal rot.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the fragility is equivalent. That line of reasoning seems to conflate extreme political dysfunction, which is undeniable, with existential state failure. While the rise in political violence is frankly appalling, contemporary democratic institutions, however stressed they are, and think of the successful checks and balances we've still seen, the judicial resilience in some cases, the capacity for nonviolent transitions of power, even under duress, they possess an institutional depth that, let's be honest, the fledgling Weimar Republic or the internally disintegrating multi-ethnic empires of the early 20th century entirely lacked. The violence before World War I was often state-sponsored or deeply embedded in irredentist movements operating right on the edge of empire. We have to acknowledge that key democracies, despite these attacks, haven't yet fully dissolved their fundamental infrastructure into warring militias. To treat a deeply polarized yet structurally still intact democracy the same as an already fracturing proto-state is, I think, a premature leap in the historical analogy. And this brings us rather neatly to this social dimension, which I feel the source material introduces, but maybe doesn't fully grapple with the nuances of. We agree, technological anxiety, AI threatening jobs, digital media fueling polarization, it's creating instability. But I wonder if we're missing a key distinction here. Before the World Wars, social collapse channeled anxiety into these unified, often hyper-nationalistic or ideological movements like fascism or Bolshevism. Today's instability seems to lead more toward fragmentation and cynicism. Is current social anxiety really a force for massive militarization? Or is it actually a force that degrades cohesion and energy, maybe leading to societal gridlock rather than global mobilization?
I think you might be framing fragmentation a bit too optimistically there. Technological anxiety, especially when combined with economic insecurity, often breeds this deep distrust in establishment competence. The collapse of belief in centralized authority, whether that's government or traditional media, is precisely the kind of systemic void that extremist ideologies rush in to fill. So I would argue that digital media doesn't just fragment, it provides these bespoke, self-reinforcing echo chambers that act as modern-day ideological cells. They're far more pervasive, far more efficient than the pamphleteering or the party rallies of the 1930s. The material shows that before World War I, it was the social anxiety and the loss of faith in traditional hierarchies that really opened the door to radical nationalism. Today, the loss of faith in a, let's say, prosperous technological future creates fertile ground for conflict-ready ideologies, whether they are explicitly nationalistic or simply focused on finding an other to blame for systemic decline. The rhyme isn't the ideology itself, perhaps, but the mechanism of societal disillusionment creating a political mandate for aggression.
Okay, let's maybe pivot to the military dimension, specifically the cohesiveness of this new axis. You characterize their alignment as transactional, suggesting inherent fragility. And I recognize the 1930s axis certainly had its internal frictions. However, I might challenge the usefulness of even labeling the current grouping the axis of dictatorships, as maybe that predetermines the narrative a bit. But let's focus on the material reality of their integration as presented. I appreciate that clarification, yes. My concern about the current alignment, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, is exactly that lack of deep, shared ideological commitment, which really fueled the 1930s expansionists. I mean, the historical Axis powers, you had Japan driven by a sense of divine manifest destiny, Germany driven by racial ideology. They had strong, singular, revisionist goals that required territorial expansion. Today's grouping seems primarily defined by a shared antagonism toward the U.S.-led order. And yes, this leads to tactical cooperation, buying sanctioned oil, supplying drones and electronics, but does it necessarily lead to the strategic coordination required for a successful, simultaneous global strike? The relative lack of ideological unity suggests potential breaking points, maybe when economic pressure increases or if tactical objectives start to diverge significantly.
That's a fair reading of the evidence regarding ideology. I grant you that. But the historical lesson, I think, is less about ideological unity and maybe more about material capacity and alliance readiness. The video explicitly details the tight, unified material support. China funneling energy and electronics to sanctioned states, North Korea providing vital ammunition for Russia's war effort. The key distinction from the 1930s isn't ideology, it's the speed and density of this material transfer, which accelerates escalation potential. Look, World War I and World War II began as regional conflicts. Ukraine is a regional conflict, Taiwan remains a flashpoint that rapidly ballooned because of alliance commitments. The mutual dependency of this modern grouping means a conflict involving one potentially accelerates the involvement of the others far faster than the relatively uncoordinated actions of the 1930s powers.
And when let's call it the aggressor bloc, is highly dependent internally, and the opposing democratic alliance is perceived as divided, the incentive to strike while they think their window of advantage is open, well, becomes truly enormous.
That emphasis on the window of opportunity brings us back, I think, to the economic dimension, where I still believe the deterrent factors are strongest today. You correctly noted that before World War I, leaders understood the immense financial costs, yet they went to war anyway. They prioritized ambition over wealth preservation. Today, however, we are not just dealing with high financial costs, we are dealing with a totally different degree of interconnected global supply chains. A conflict between major powers wouldn't just be expensive. It would likely lead to a near-immediate systemic failure of crucial global systems, food, energy, microchips, you name it. And I recognize the historical precedent of nations valuing relative power over absolute wealth, which led to that pursuit of self-sufficiency before World War II. But I would argue that today's push towards self-sufficiency, or de-risking, is often fundamentally defensive.
It's focused on supply chain resilience, minimizing geopolitical risk exposure, rather than solely being about aggressive territorial expansion aimed at acquiring natural resources, like, say, Germany and Japan sought. The sheer cost of destroying the current globalized system acts as a profound disincentive. So economics might not guarantee peace, no, but they impose a vastly higher cost structure on war initiation now. And that factor, I believe, significantly alters the historical cadence. I'm just not convinced that the potential cost structure truly outweighs fear and ambition, especially in regimes where the leadership might be somewhat insulated from those immediate popular costs. The very movement toward economic nationalism, accelerated after the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine, proves that states do prioritize autonomy and security over optimal interdependence when push comes to shove. The moment a state believes its dependence on a rival creates a fatal vulnerability, well, that interdependence shifts from being a deterrent to being a target for disruption itself. The fact that major powers are actively de-risking, sacrificing efficiency for control, seems to confirm the historical lesson. When the political and military dimensions align for conflict, the economic calculus shifts. It becomes one of relative strength and self-sufficiency, not global GDP preservation. We are seeing states act today much as they did when they prioritized being more powerful than their rivals, not just wealthier overall. So, wrapping up my side, history doesn't repeat, no, but it often rhymes. And the analysis of these four dimensions, I believe, successfully reveals that the critical elements necessary for global conflict are converging today. We have societies destabilized by technological anxiety, leading towards political extremism. We have heightened relative power competition driving economic nationalism. We have extreme political polarization that actively seems to sanction violence. And most alarmingly, we have increasingly integrated aggressor alliances ready to exploit this perceived internal weakness in democracies. These factors, taken together, point toward the brink, much as they did before the two previous world wars.
That is a very powerful summary of the risks identified in the source material. I agree. However, my perspective remains that historical patterns offer useful warnings, certainly, but not inevitable outcomes. While the instability in the social, economic, and political spheres is extremely serious, the leap to inevitable global conflict risks overlooking, I think, the fundamentally new deterrents we've discussed, specifically the sheer scale of economic interdependence and perhaps the underlying institutional resilience of contemporary democracies, however stressed they may be. Understanding the past sharpens our view of present dangers, absolutely, but the unique elements of today mean the rhyme might be significantly altered from the original tragic cadence.
Right. And I think regardless of our differing conclusions on the ultimate probability of conflict, we certainly both agree on the fundamental necessity of paying close attention to these signals and using historical insight across all these dimensions, social, economic, political, military, to actively try and avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. That seems crucial.